What's up, guys? This is One Concerned American. Thanks for listening to today's show. I want to cover a secret society called the Knights of the Golden Circle. A lot of historians like to completely ignore the fact that this society had a lot to do with our Civil War, or the war between the states, as I like to call it. And a lot of people like to completely avoid this topic altogether. But I'm going to give you some evidence from 3 books. We're going to go over the symbols of this organization. And then I'm going to tie in some other concepts that I think will wrap this all together nicely for you. And then I'm also going to introduce my Patreon page to you and tell you how you can help this channel out. So I want to start off by talking about the election of 1860. If you take a look at this map, people, Abraham Lincoln actually won the election of 1860 with less than 40% of the vote. If you look at the map, you'll notice that the Democrats actually ran 2 candidates. A Northern Democrat named Stephen Douglas, and a Southern Democrat named John Breckinridge. Breckinridge had actually been the vice president under James Buchanan, and we'll cover him a little bit more in this video because he is an alleged member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. But I want you to just do some basic math here, people. Look at the blue and green on this map and the percentage of the votes. If the Democrats had simply come together and united under one candidate, they actually would have beaten Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War would have never happened. But they intentionally split their own party to throw this election and lead us into the Civil War. And I'm not saying every single Democrat candidate was responsible for this, but I am telling you that the Knights of the Golden Circle were heavily involved in this, and they are a part of why this country split apart. Now, a lot of people think that the Knights of the Golden Circle were founded by some secretive, shady Southern slaveholders who wanted to expand their empire into Cuba and Latin America. But if you actually look into this society, it was founded by a man from Ohio named George Bickley. And Bickley was actually trying to raise funds for invasions into Mexico, and they would put out a lot of propaganda about why America should intervene in Latin America. So this was started by a Yankee from Ohio, and it was actually mostly filled with people from the North. There were some prominent members from the South, but as I'll show you in this video, they were all across the United States, and they were instrumental in dividing this country throughout the years of the Civil War. Now, this is a map of what the potential territory that the Knights of the Golden Circle were looking to build into an empire. And I think if you look at this symbol here, this is evidence that the Knights of the Golden Circle were trying to build an empire. You can look here and you can see the crown and the cross. It's a marriage between the two, which represents a merger of church and state. Now, to what extent this potential empire would have merged church and state, I cannot tell you, but I can tell you that this group was definitely looking to foment revolution here in the United States. And it's evident through one of their most prominent symbols, which you see here. It's a triangle, and if you go across the triangle, you add up the numbers 7, 3, and 5, you get the number 15, okay? Then you also have a large capital letter R in the center over the number 61. And what this symbol represents, ladies and gentlemen, is a revolution of 15 states in the year 1861. And if you study the American Civil War, it almost was a war between 15 Confederate states and the United States, because the states of Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland were Democrat states that considered or tried to secede and were prevented. This symbol tells it all, ladies and gentlemen, and it was a prominent symbol of the Knights of the Golden Circle. It was circulated throughout all the places that they were prominent, and it's very easily identified with the organization. If you want to see how this organization impacted American policy leading up to the Civil War, you need to study the administration of James Buchanan and his political career up to his presidency. James Buchanan actually had some people in his cabinet that are associated with the Knights of the Golden Circle, like John C. Breckinridge, the man who threw the 1860 election. And if you look at James Buchanan before he became president, he was a major part of writing the Austin Manifesto. And if you read into the Austin Manifesto, this was a group of politicians that included James Buchanan, and they wrote a manifesto calling for the purchase of Cuba from Spain by the United States and proposed attacking and seizing Cuba if Spain refused. Now, the man who actually introduced this plan, ladies and gentlemen, was named Auguste Belmont. And Auguste Belmont was a European Rothschild agent. He was married to Matthew Perry's daughter. If you don't know, Matthew Perry actually helped open up Japan. He served as minister to the Netherlands under Franklin Pierce, and he served as a member of the Tammany Society and then the Union League of New York. He was chairman of the Democrat Party for much of the Civil War. And again, the Democrats, they were the party that seceded during the Civil War. So it's very unusual that this man who was a Rothschild agent was behind this major nationalist policy from the United States that almost got us into a war with Spain. And if you go back and watch my conspiratorial history videos of the United States, you'll see how England, France, they had agents here, they had provocateurs here in the early days of this republic trying to subvert the United States and foment revolutions. And it's something that still goes on to this day, people. Now, the first book I want to get into to kind of introduce some of the ideas of the Knights of the Golden Circle to you are this report from the Judge Advocate General on the Order of American Knights, or the Sons of Liberty, as the Knights of the Golden Circle had come to be known throughout the war. It actually changed its name a couple of times, and you can see here it also says that this is a Western conspiracy, meaning that it was trying to turn some of these Western states into potential Confederate states. Now, the first part of this that I want to read to you, it says that the secret organization first developed itself in the West in the year 1862, about the period of the first conscription. It was originally known as the Mutual Protection Society, the Circle of Honor, the Circle, or Knights of the Mighty Host, and it became widely known as the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, my opinion is that it was possibly started before the date of 1862, but that's where this report puts it. If you see here, it says the Grand Commander in Indiana, his name was H. Dodd, had been tried at Indianapolis by a military commission for conspiracy against the government, violation of the laws of war, and other charges. So again, there were many Northerners that were a part of this, that sympathized with the Confederacy, and were even trying to get their states to join the Confederacy. So people think that the Knights of the Golden Circle were just Southern slaveholders. You're not playing with a full deck of cards. In fact, half your deck is missing, and you don't even know. You can go on to see that the members of this organization, they were advised to commit perjury whenever questioned about it, and he said that they were instructed to refuse to answer such questions, alleging as to the ground for their refusal that their answers may incriminate themselves. And this was especially something that was going on again with members who were coming from Indiana. The next work I want to go over with you is called A Treason History of the Order of Sons of Liberty, formerly known as the Circle of Honor, succeeded by the Knights of the Golden Circle. And the man who wrote this book, his name is Felix Stidger. He was a United States government Secret Service agent, Grand Secretary for the state of Kentucky in the Order of the Sons of Liberty. So he claims to be a member of this organization, and this is him telling you what he saw. And this is going to kind of go over some of the things that they believe and some of the creeds that they have to say in order to join this organization. So you can see here first it says, the government designated the United States of America has no sovereignty. In accordance with the principles upon which is founded the American theory, government can exercise only delegated powers. Which is true. I mean, read the 10th Amendment. You know, it's not that hard to figure out. It goes on to say, to this is added as a corollary, it is incompatible with the history and nature of our system of government that federal authority should coerce by arms a sovereign state. And this is interesting because, again, if you go back and study James Buchanan as the president, South Carolina seceded after Lincoln's election but before his inauguration. So James Buchanan was a lame duck president who basically did nothing. I mean, he put some soldiers in Fort Sumter, but his own advisors had basically told him that he had no right to invade a state or to coerce a state, and you can look that up. So again, James Buchanan, his cabinet was heavily influenced by people who were in the Knights of the Golden Circle. Going on, another part of their oath says that I will never take up arms in behalf of any government which does not acknowledge the sole authority or power to be the will of the governed. And again, I mean, if you really think about what this is saying, it's really appealing to the ideas of the American Revolution. Going on, it says, "And further, I do promise that I will, at all times, if needs be, take up arms in the cause of the oppressed." So again, these are good ideals to instill into people joining the society, but at the end of the day, you do need to remember that some of the people involved, they were slaveholders. I mean, we can't get around that, and they were people that weren't about to go and actually fight in this war, so they did profit by having people actually join the society and believe these ideas. Going on, the next book I want to get into is called An Authentic Exposition of the KGC, Knights of the Golden Circle, A History of Secession from 1834 to 1861 by a member of the order. If you read this paragraph here, I'll let you pause it if you want to read this. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but it actually goes over the grips that these guys had whenever they met and some of the signs that they were supposed to give and things they had to say to confirm to other people that they were members of this society. Now, this is where it gets really, really interesting, and I want you to pay attention because this is something we're going to come back to at the end of the video. Part of the initiation into the society involved people wearing certain regalia and emblems, and it was actually a very ancient ceremony that these guys did to initiate people. And if you look at the image on the right here, you see that it's described as a close helmet for the head, from the top which peers upward a small silver spear. And then it also says that one of their major symbols is the skull and bones, to signify death to all abolitionists and opposers of Southern independence. So again, they're really kind of instilling this idea that these guys are knights, but I want you to notice that symbolism of the pointed helmet. We're going to come back to that again later on in this video, so keep that in mind. We also have in this book some letters from people who were from Indiana and other states around the Union talking about their membership in the Knights of the Golden Circle. You can see one man say, from Indiana, "You may tell the friends of Southern rights that our district can turn out at least 1,000 men who will fight Northern aggression to the death. Be of good cheer and work faithfully, yours for the right." Another from Indiana says, "Dear sir, tell the friends that our county alone will be found good for one regiment of brave men who will shed their last drop of blood before they will submit to abolition rule. Put us down as a number 1. Very respectfully yours." Another account, this one says that it's also from Indiana. "I think I can tell pretty accurately how she stands," talking about his state. He says, "There are 30,000 voters in this state who will never compromise with black republicanism, and I think I may safely say that there are at least 10,000 who will shoulder their muskets in defense of the rights of their Southern brethren." We see another one from Carlisle. I believe that this is also in Indiana. They say, "I have taken the pains to count noses in the district, especially in this county, and I can set you down at the least calculation 2,000 fighting men who will, at a moment's warning, in case of need, march to the standard of Southern rights. And it is highly probable that the whole of Indiana south of the National Road will secede and unite its fortune with the South when Lincoln is elected." So again, you can look and you'll find that the reports show that these guys were all over the country, and especially in Indiana. It's very interesting because, again, these are northern states that people typically only identify with Union views and anti-slavery views. Now, this work also gets into some raw numbers. And if you look here, they say Indiana was thought to have at least 10,000 members ready to fight for the KGC. Ohio, about 5,000. Illinois, 5,000. Pennsylvania, at least 15,000. New York, about 50,000. And again, we know New York was a hotbed of secession, and they saw riots during the draft. Iowa had about 5,000. Michigan had about 5,000. And that totaled to about 95,000 people. Okay? So that's no small force. That's a large amount of people. If you had 95,000 people marching on D.C., I mean, that'd be something to be worried about. Now, I want to get into some of these people who played both sides, people who were part of the Knights of the Golden Circle, people who really actively worked to tear this country apart and lead us into civil war. And I want you to really examine these people very closely here. The first one is John C. Breckinridge. Again, I showed you the map at the beginning. He was the Southern Democrat who split the vote and actually led to Lincoln's election. You can see here he has the hidden hand symbolism. A lot of us are very aware of what that means. Breckinridge served the Senate. He was the youngest ever vice president under Buchanan. He was in the House of Representatives, and he became the Confederate Secretary of War. His grandfather was actually the man who introduced the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798. Again, if you go back to my second video on the conspiratorial history of the United States, I talk a little bit about this. So his grandfather actually planted the seed for states' rights and nullification and secession, and then he goes on in 1860 to actually break this country apart in this election. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, guys. And he is alleged to be a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Breckinridge is alleged to have maintained correspondence with people who were a part of it. And there's even people who allege that they were going to give money to Breckinridge for his efforts, and he was going to help Indiana, things like this. So when you look into it, there's a lot of evidence that Breckinridge was a member. He's also a Freemason, a highly degreed one. If you look into George Sanders is a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle who was actually denied confirmation into the United States Senate because he had been involved with some radical European revolutionary activities around the time of 1848. Now, if you look into George Sanders, he was allegedly working for Jefferson Davis as an ex officio part of the Confederate Commissioners to Canada. George Sanders met with John Wilkes Booth just before Lincoln's assassination. And after the war, Sanders went and lived in a Paris commune in 1871. So, very weird figure. There's also some pretty good substantial evidence that John Wilkes Booth was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. And I mean, just look into the crime, people. The man was shot before he was able to tell his side of the story. He was never able to have his day in court. So that should tell you he might have even lived through this thing. I mean, we don't really know the whole truth about what happened to Lincoln at the end of the day. Another person who I want to point out that is not necessarily a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, but I think he's someone you need to look into a little bit, is Benjamin Butler. He was a 33rd degree Freemason by the year 1864, and he's another person who helped contribute to secession and breaking this country apart. He actually was a staunch Democrat for a long time. He helped start a newspaper called the Democratic Review, which served to help the Young America movement. And if you remember, I talked about them. They were basically some radical nationalists that wanted to spread American influence all over the world. And in 1860, Benjamin Butler actually supported Breckinridge for president, and then he supported Jefferson Davis. So he was a Democrat, basically all about Southern rights until secession happened, and then he switched and became a Republican. And if you look at his behavior during the war, it's absolutely disgusting. People called him the Beast because he basically had no problem with killing civilians. At one point in New Orleans, he publicly executed a man who tried to take down a United States flag. So definitely look into Benjamin Butler a little bit. I think he's definitely part of some of these secret societies that trying to bring down the United States. Clement Vallandigham is probably the most interesting figure out of all this. At one point, he is noted to have been the leader of the Knights of the Golden Circle, and by that point, it had changed its name to the Order of the Sons of Liberty. And you can see here, this is from the work by Stidger. It says Vallandigham had been arrested at his home in Dayton, Ohio, on May 5, 1863, and taken to Cincinnati, where he was tried before a military commission on May 6th and found guilty of using seditious language in public speeches and sentenced to confinement, and was sent to Fort Warren, Boston Harbor, and was on May 19, 1863, by order of Lincoln, banished from the United States and sent through the lines of the Army May 24th into the Southern Confederacy. You can also see that Clement Vallandigham was a Mason as well, and there's a lot of interesting things about this man, people. Look into how Clement Vallandigham died. He was an attorney, and the story goes that he was showing a group of lawyers how a client had actually shot himself, and then Vallandigham, through this demonstration, accidentally shot himself and died. And if you look into it, the people who were involved with this, they're actually not very well known to history, and there's a lot of mystery behind his death. So I think there's something very unusual about Clement Vallandigham, and more investigation needs to be done for sure. Clement Vallandigham, He is, again, one of the leaders of the Knights of the Golden Circle. And if you look into it, he had really close ties to this guy, Edwin Stanton, who was actually a member of Lincoln's cabinet. And according to what many researchers have found, Clement Vallandigham at one point actually gave a $500 loan to Edwin Stanton. And if you look into Stanton, he was actually on James Buchanan's Southern Rights cabinet, and he was all about secession. He was fine with Southern rights until the Civil War broke out, and then he joined and became a radical Republican. So he actually, behind Lincoln's back, said that he was painfully imbecilic, and he was actually alleged to have a major part in Lincoln's assassination. So again, Stanton, one of the scumbags that helped divide this country. Now, another interesting thing I want to point out here, if you look into it, this is someone named Stephen Hager, who is the author of a book named Killing Lincoln, The Real Story. Clement Vallandigham is alleged to be a very close friend with Edwin Stanton, and he's known to have given him a $500 loan. Now, it's really interesting when you get into all this. Clement Vallandigham also was one of the only congressmen that was allowed to interrogate John Brown. Okay? Now, John Brown, a lot of people know he was basically a terrorist. He was trying to start a slave insurrection. And John Brown, he went through a lot in his life. A lot of people are divided over whether he's a hero or a terrorist. I'm not going to get into that in this video. But if you look into John Brown, okay, the biggest source of funding for what John Brown did came from a man named William Russell, who was the founder of Skull and Bones. And I talked about Skull and Bones in my conspiratorial history of the United States. And if you look into William Russell, he's also from a wealthy family that basically ran a North American opium cartel. Probably the most interesting thing about William Russell that not a lot of people know is that if you look into it, he was actually drilling his students many years before the Civil War. We're talking about the year 1840. He was drilling his students for anticipation of a Civil War. Okay? And we also need to remember that William Russell spent at least 2 years in Germany. And Germany is where the Illuminati came out of. It's where some of these illuminated European universities came out of. So the connection is there, people. Clement Vallandigham is the only man who meets with John Brown. One of the only men who meets with John Brown. John Brown is funded by this man who spent time in Germany and funds all of his terrorist activity. So you need to look into this, people. I mean, these secret societies, they were trying to bring the United States down because we were really becoming world leaders early on. They hate our Republican system of government. They want to destroy our Constitution. Again, you can see here one of the major logos of the Knights of the Golden Circle is the skull and crossbones. Do you think it's a coincidence? Do you think it's just happenstance? I mean, come on, guys. Now, again, I think it's kind of crazy that when you look into the Knights of the Golden Circle, part of their initiation had these people dressing up with metal spikes in their helmet. And I think it's crazy that these guys like William Russell, who spent time in Germany, were funding John Brown. And if you really look into the Civil War, guys, the Germans, they were a major part of this. If you look into the 48ers, they were a whole group that came to the United States after these failed revolutions in 1848. And they were basically coming here to raise some hell in the United States. Now, if you look, there were thousands of Germans and immigrants who fought on the Union side. And there were some of them like Carl Schurz. He went on to have great success after the war. I mean, he became like a major secretary. He traveled around the world. And if you look into it, they actually had a foundation named after him in around the year 1930, I believe, and has some major socialist ties. We can also see that the Germans were heavily involved with this group called the Turner Company. You also got to look at this man named Joseph Gerhardt. He was a 48er who helped found the Turner Company in Washington. They were the first volunteer group assembled after Lincoln's call for troops, and there were about 70,000 volunteers he called for, and the first people that really signed up were these Germans, okay? Lincoln also purchased German language newspapers, and he closed down other newspapers that criticized him. So you need to understand that had these forces not been fighting for the Union, and had these radical German secret societies not infiltrated the United States and tried to break us apart, the Civil War might have came out very differently. It might have never happened at all. And I think it's very interesting. I mean, again, just look at this poster here. You can see that the skull and crossbones on the bottom left-hand corner, it's a major symbol of the Knights of the Golden Circle. And we've seen this throughout history, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, not just the Skull and Bones Society, but if you look into the group, the Black Hand, they were this Serbian nationalist group who assassinated Franz Ferdinand and led to the outbreak of the First World War. They had a skull and crossbones on their symbol. You can also see the Nazis. The skull and crossbones was also a very popular symbol with them. So it's not just these societies and these groups in themselves. You need to look at who is funding these groups. Okay, where are they getting their money from? That's what you should be trying to study here. Because again, everything about the American Civil War, when you really break it down, it stinks of foreign influence. It stinks of just needless division. This country would be stronger together, guys. I'm a states' rights man myself. I believe whatever you do in your state shouldn't affect me in my state. I think that states have the right to secede. But if you look into it, this group, the Knights of the Golden Circle, they were really probably being pulled by foreign strings, and they used the influence of slavery and all the money and power that came with that institution to really pull this country into a civil war. That's my take on the Knights of the Golden Circle. Again, a lot of people deny their existence and think that there's nothing there, but I think if you look into it, there's a lot there, people. And I think that they're a major reason that this country had 600,000 people die from the year 1861 to 1865. Now, the last thing I want to go over is my Patreon. You can see here, it's patreon.com/one_concern_American. And if you donate $1 monthly to this channel, I will give you full access to my library, which includes books like all the works by Anthony Sutton, all the works by Fritz Springmeier, like Bloodlines of the Illuminati. Basically everything I have as far as these documents I've gone over showing people in the United States committing treason and destroying our Constitution. I've got books by Manly P. Hall, Albert Pike, a lot of good books on Freemasonry, like the Scarlet Book of Freemasonry. So a lot of really good stuff there. I hope that you'll join me. If you can just make a small one-time donation and you reach out to me about a certain book that you're looking for, maybe there's a way I can share it with you and we can research this stuff together. So I really appreciate you watching this video. I appreciate everybody out there who supports this channel, and God bless all of you and your families.